Namaste friends, welcome back to this lecture number 6 in the series on course on psychology of language. What we have been doing in this course is we are looking at the psychological aspect of language, what it means, how it is developed, how it is perceived and how a language is used as a medium of communication. Before we start this lecture, which is the 6th lecture, and progress on the concept of speech perception, let us take a look back at what we did up till now on what we have been doing in this course up till now. So, we started off this course by looking at the basic of language, the meaning of language, why it is needed, and the best model to do that is to look at animal communication systems. So, we started off by looking at animal communication systems. We looked at the modes of an animal communication and we looked at the reasons of why animals communicate, and therefore, thereon we looked at 4 different needs why animals communicate, right from finding foes to finding friends or for just finding food or replication, that these are the needs. So, we discussed that as reasons why animals communicate. And then we looked at certain characteristics of the animal communication system. We moved ahead by looking at the human language and the basics of human language and what is the difference of human language system and the animal language system. So, there we focused on the fact that human language can very well transmit a number of messages, various types of messages and express different messages, but that is not possible with the animal language system, and that is one of the distinctions. But there are several other distinctions of the human language system from the animal language system. For example, being that human language systems are governed by rules and they have structured components. So, they have a syntax, a way of expressing the language system. Also, they are productive in nature and human language systems use arbitrary symbols of various facts of the human language system. Then we looked at things like duality of patterning, recursive structure and several other characteristics of the human language system. We looked at how the human language system is arranged in terms of the phonemes, basic speech sounds to the morpheme, the word, sentence, discourse and so on and so forth. So, how it is basically built up, the phrase, the sentence and so on and so forth. So, that is another thing that we looked at. Further to it, we looked at the evolution of language, how human language system actually evolved from animals, and we looked at the continuity and discontinuity theories of language production or how language develop, and both of them have their own ideas of how human language evolved. And then we looked at certain proofs of the proto language, because human language system was believed to be an upcoming of slow development from the prior humans or the monkeys, I would call them. So, we looked at evidences that support this view that it was a series of changes that led to the present complex language that we know of. So, we verified the idea of proto language and we looked at evidences, for example, the evidence of a pidgin, which is basically a language system which has certain action words and a handful of other words which can express meaning between 2 language systems, where both the parties expressing the language or talking to each other, expressing views with each other cannot understand their either's language. So, pidgin is basically an evidence for the fact that language developed in a progressive manner. So, that was what we did initially, and since we had laid the foundation of the language system and what is language and the principles of language and the basics of language, we moved on to looking at the science of language. So, there we described the famous N400 experiment, and then we described the scientific method in detail, right, expressing what is a problem statement, how a hypothesis is formulated, and how this hypothesis leads to the generation of or the hypothesis, how this hypothesis is generated rather from a theory, and how that is tested. So, we looked at the research cycle, which is how theory leads to hypothesis, which further leads to observations, and these observations lead to certain patterns, and these patterns verify the theory, maybe verify or not verify the theory. So, we looked at the research cycle of how research is basically done. We looked at experimental designs which are used for conducting experiments in language and in specific and social sciences in general, and so we looked at within subject design and the idea of between subject design. We also looked at various component of the experimental process, like what are different kind of variables, the independent variable, the dependent variable, and how they are manipulated and how they construct the whole idea of doing research. So, having described the independent variable, another idea or another step was describing the dependent variable, which was what do we measure out of these experiments that we do in language. And so, we looked at the idea of latency, which is the reaction time of how quickly something is set upon, or how quickly something is a particular act is done, and we also looked at accuracy of how correct a particular act is. So, these two measures are the main measures that is generally used in experimental treatments of our experimental problems in language. Further, we dedicated a section on language and brain, and we looked at how various regions of the brain are processing language. For example, the idea of Wernicke area, the idea of Broca's area, and how these areas have their say in language. So, that is what we did in the second section, which is chapter number lecture number 3 and 4. Now, the previous lecture that we did was on looking at perception of sound. So, how does sound how are sound produced, and what is speaking basically. So, how sound is the idea of sound is perceived. So, we looked at certain parameters of sound as a wave. So, we looked at the amplitude and frequency, which is the basic measure or the basic parameters of any sound wave. Then we looked at the idea of the fundamental frequency and the idea of overtones of what they are. Further to that, we looked at how these sounds are periodic and periodic in nature, and how these periodic and periodic sounds are the sounds of vowels and consonants. Then further to it, we looked at the structure of the ear, of how the ear perceives sound. So, we looked at how the outer ear, the inner ear and the middle ear, they combine with each other, and we looked in detail the idea of the cochlea and the basilar membrane, which perceives or which notices changes in the sound wave as they flow on the liquid on the basilar membrane. We looked at the tonotopic organization of the basilar membrane, and how this basilar membrane which have hair cells which pick up the sound waves, how they are connected to the primary auditory cortex and the secondary auditory cortex, and how the organization of the primary and secondary auditory cortex are similar in way to the basilar membrane, which is tonotropic in organization. We then looked at how the speech stream looks like. So, when we speak something, what is it exactly? We tried to look at that, and with the help of spectrograph, or with the help of what a spectrograph notices, we tried to look at what is the speech stream like, or what is speech like. So, what is a spectrograph? Spectrograph visualizes the structure of the speech stream. So, we looked at that, and thereupon we tried to look at what are consonants and what are vowels, and how these consonants and vowels are distinguished based on the spectrograph. We also looked at what the idea of phonation, which is the vibration of the vocal fold. And we also looked at the idea of what is prosody, which is the changes, subtle changes in the vocal cord around the fundamental frequency. Now, we also looked at certain other characteristics of the speech stream. For example, the idea of formants or sorents, and how these formants and sorents. So, formants basically are for vowels and sorents are kind of vowel, and then we looked at plosives and fricatives, which are the representation of consonants onto the speech stream. So, that is what we were doing in the last class. Then further to that, we looked at how sound is perceived or in categorical format. So, basically the if you look at a speech stream on a spectrograph, you will look at a continuous, you will look at, you will not look at a continuous pattern, you will look at patterns which have higher amplitudes and no amplitudes in between, and then again higher amplitude. So, we looked at how this is interpreted, because speech is continuous in nature. So, how does the spectrogram represent it? And so, the space white spaces which you see in a spectrogram are actually consonants, and these are called the stop consonants. So, that is what it is, and so speech actually merges itself. So, then we looked at how the speech is perceived, and we saw that speech sound or speech is perceived in terms of categorical perception or in terms of categories. So, sound, speech sounds are forced into various categories, and that is how they are perceived, and that was what we were looking at. So, to demonstrate that speech is perceived in or categorical perception happens in speech, famous phoneme restoration effect was demonstrated. That is where we ended the section, and we saw how Warren and Warren did an experiment and showed how this phoneme restoration effect is basically demonstrated. To end the section, in the last class we described something called McGraw effect, which basically says that speech perception is not only through the auditory medium, but other mediums also, like visual medium is also used, and we demonstrated the idea of how somebody speaking and somebody lip speaking a particular word, how when they are shown to the same person, how the person misreads. So, basically multimodal approach to perception, saying that auditory feedback is not, the auditory stimulation is not the only way of speech perception. A multimodal technique is used by the human brain to perceive speech. Now, what we are going to do in today's class is look at how speech is developed in the neonates, in small children, how speech is developed, and towards the end of the section we will look at several theories of speech perception. So, that is what the aim is presently in this lecture. So, development of speech perception and language learning in the womb. So, how does it starts in the smaller children. So, language learning, it generally begins in the womb during the 3rd trimester. So, by the 3rd trimester, the neonate or the baby inside the fetus inside the mother's womb is able to hear speech sounds or is able to perceive speech sound, which extends from week number 28 until birth, that is weeks number 38 or later. So, from the 3rd trimester onwards, the baby is able to actually hear speech sounds of the mother or other people around the womb. So, during the, as you can see, that is the same thing that I have here. So, during the 3rd trimester, fetuses can hear mother's voice and environmental sounds, and so it tries, and it is also able to distinguish this mother's voice and environmental sound. Now, a fetus at the 3rd trimester can hear and respond to sounds in the environment, particularly the mother's voice. So, that is what it can do, and there were a number of experiments which are there, which were done to prove that the baby is able to hear the mother's sound and other environmental noises, and these can be done with either the head movement reflex or the nipple sucking reflex. So, there are several experimental techniques which are used for showing that this kind of response or the fetus is actually able to hear the sounds. Now, one way to demonstrate that the fetus is able to hear the sound is the change in fetal heart rate. So, the fetuses can discriminate stimuli. So, when the fetus hears actually a stimuli, a vocal stimuli or speech stimuli which is different from, or novel stimuli which is different from what he has been hearing, the heart rate increases, but when he hears a stimuli which is similar to what he has been hearing, he decreases the heart rate. And so, that particular response is what is demonstration of the fact that the fetuses can actually hear the sounds. Now, at birth, the newborn can already distinguish its mother's voice from other women's voice and its mother's language from other language. Now, at week number 35 and 37, fetuses can recognize mother's voice, mother's language spoken by another woman, and primary nursery rhyme. So, even if so there were experiments done in which the mother's fundamental frequency or the fundamental pitch was removed, it was filtered out, and only the basic prosody was there, or the basic prosody of the mother's tone was there in the voice. So, higher frequencies were split out. Even then the child was able to respond to, or child was able to hear the mother's voice or distinguish the mother's voice in terms of the heart rate. Also, if another woman which is not the mother, if she speaks in a manner similar to the mother, the child actually showed a change in its basic heart rate, which basically means that he was able to realize the, or able to respond to the mother's language. Now, in one experiment, Dr. Seuss fairy tale was told, was recited to these 35-37 years fetuses, and so they were able to respond to these even if a different woman other than the mother was playing this particular, or was reciting this particular nursery rhymes. So, infant direct, another interesting thing which used to measure the fact that babies can hear speech sounds was the high amplitude sucking technique. So, in this technique what was happening is a non-nutritive nipple was given to the baby, and he would suck on the way he sucks on to the nipple on hearing different sounds, familiar and non-familiar sounds, demonstrated how or whether the baby can distinguish between the mother's voice or familiar voice versus non-familiar voices. So, measures frequency of infant sucking on non-nutritive nipple, and changes in the frequency indicate discrimination of stimulus, and this was used on newborn. So, this is another interesting thing which was there, and so this was used to demonstrate the fact that babies, smaller children were able to hear this sound, or distinction between familiar and non-familiar sounds. Now, newborns are known to prefer mother's voice, and so this was demonstrated by the high amplitude sucking technique. Also, mother's language which is spoken by another woman was also preferred by most newborns. So, as related to the fetal or the fetus which actually demonstrated a change in heart rate, similar to them, newborns also demonstrated this high amplitude through the high amplitude sucking technique. They also demonstrated that they preferred mother's language if spoken by another woman more than any other text which other woman was speaking. Also, familiar nursery rhymes which they hear in the womb, when it was played back after they were born, they preferred to that, and that was demonstrated through this high amplitude sucking technique. Now, clearly newborns remember what they heard in the womb, and so this basically demonstrates that the baby, the fetus, were actually able to hear these sounds, or these changes in sounds, or were able to discriminate between these sounds. Now, how do the mother pass on this language ability into the child, and so that happens to something called baby talk. So, what we have demonstrated, what we have established up till now is the fact that the babies or fetuses or newborns, they can distinguish or they can hear voice or the mother, and they can make distinctions between the mother's voice and or another familiar voices with different voices, and that we have shown that not only at the level of the fetus, but also when they are born they show this distinguishing. So, at the fetus level, the change in heart rate is a measurement of the likingness to a certain sound, and or the distinguishing between a certain familiar and non-familiar voices. When they are born, the newborns as old as 1 month old, by using the sucking technique, the high amplitude sucking technique, they also can demonstrate that they can differentiate between various changes into the or they can discriminate between familiar non-familiar voices. Now, the question is how mothers are able to teach their children to speak. So, how do they perceive speech, or how the speech perception is taught by the mothers to the small children, and that happens by something called infant directed speech. So, as you know, most infant directed speech are something called motherese. So, these are a manner in which the child and the mother they speak to each other, or most caregivers speak to the children. So, they are basically small utterances with high pitch utterances, and so these are what is called motherese. So, infant directed speech is spoken with a higher fundamental frequency, a broader pitch range, and exaggerated information and stress pattern. And so, this kind of directed speech is the first demonstration or the first way in which the mother interacts with the child. So, the manner of speaking to infants attracts their attention and helps them to learn the language. So, basically language learning starts right when the child is born, and this starts with the infant directed speech with either the mothers or the caregivers give to the children. And so, what are they? These are high these are speech with high fundamental frequency and a broader pitch range, and so they have exaggerated information with different stress patterns. So, higher fundamental frequency, then greater range of pitch, also exaggerated stress, contrast and vowel lengths. So, speaking to children, we generally use the stress on any word is exaggerated, and the vowel length also. When speaking of vowel, the way we speak to children, small children or just born infants, the way we see this, the vowel length is also increased. So, this is done so that the child is able to perceive the speech or perceive the speech changes, the changes that is happening in the speech, and so that is the first learning, or this is the first technique of speaking, of making the children learn the speech. So, nearly universal phenomena, and so this way of speaking with exaggerated stress, contrast and vowel length by the mother to the children is a universal phenomena. So, all across the world it is the same way the mother speak to the children. Now, right after birth itself, the child spends a lot of time with the mother, and there is a lot of eye contact and there is a lot of speaking from both the sides. Although the child may not be able to speak, but he expresses himself in terms of woos and calls, and that is responded by speech by the mother, and that is the first way or the first technique or the first step in language learning by the child. So, the child is able to perceive those changes, perceive changes in the phonation, or perceive the prosodic changes in the mother's voice, and that is how he starts learning how to speak, or what speech is made up of, or how language is. One interesting fact, when a child is born, he can distinguish at the time of being birth, he can distinguish probably all between all languages. So, give him any language and he will be able to discriminate between two patterns of speech, but as he grows, by the first month itself, he loses this capacity of understanding or pointing out changes in patterns of speech, and so that we will discuss later in the speech perception theory, or the theory of speech perception. So, basically what we are trying to, I am trying to tell you here is that the manner of speaking of the mother, it has a lot of role in developing the language system. And so what it is, how does it start? It starts by the mother basically producing high fundamental frequency sounds, and these high fundamental frequency sounds are what is perceived by the children. So basically this is called the motherese or caregiver speech. So this pattern of speaking of using elaborated syllables and longer vowels and way of speaking is motherese or caregiver's speech. Now these motherese and caregiver speech is the fundamental step in teaching the child, the newborn, the basics of any language. And so there is a theory which is called the prosodic bootstrapping theory, which says that this particular motherese or caregiver speech, the way it is delivered to the children or the way it is used in the children, it actually helps the children in identifying speech or in identifying how a particular language is spoken. So the prosodic bootstrapping hypothesis, it proposes that infants use intonations and stress patterns to infer phase and word boundaries. So how does the infant know when a word has ended, or what is a word and what is a phrase? And the way he does is by using something called prosodic bootstrapping. So he looks at intonations, which is how the mother's voice is changing, and the stress that the mother is putting in the motherese, and based on these intonations and stresses, the child is able to demarcate the word boundaries and phrase boundaries in the speech. And so that is the first step in learning to speak the particular language. Now there are a number of a number of evidences which basically support the notion of prosodic bootstrapping. So whether prosodic bootstrapping happens or not, the idea of prosodic bootstrapping, whether it happens or not, there is a lot of evidences, or there are at least some evidences out there which suggests that this prosodic bootstrapping actually happens. Now for example, infants are sensitive to indicators of phase boundaries and motherese, and so the one of the evidences is that the infants are actually sensitive or show sensitiveness to indicators of phase boundaries and in the motherese. So this basically sensitivity to phase boundaries suggests that infants are able to bootstrap the prosodic speech and or prosodies in the speech, and so are able to distinguish between word boundaries. Also there was a ERP study which was done on 5 months old German infants, and what was found out that they were sensitive to acoustic cues and phase boundaries, pitch changes and vowel duration. And according to this pitch changes and vowel duration, the German children 5 months old, they were able to understand the spoken speech, or they were able to at least use cues from the acoustic motherese that was used. And so that made them understand what is the boundary of a word, or where a word is there and where a phrase has ended, and how this actual speech is composed of, what in what pattern it is arranged, and where should the breaks be. So basically at the point of time when they don't know what a word is or what a phrase is, the certain cues from the way the mother speaks to the child, these cues are utilized by the child to understand word boundaries. And so this is a basically a very interesting fact, that children as small as 5 months old are able to distinguish these kind of patterns or this kind of syntax or rules into the spoken stream. Another interesting thing is about the English language. So the English language has a metrical segment strategy, which basically means that most English languages have stress on the first syllable and not on the second syllable, unlike some other languages out there like French, which has the stress, generally it has stress on the second syllable. And so metrical segment strategy is another strategy which is used both by the infants and adults, not by the adult but the infants, to understand the speech stream or to understand the boundaries. So according to the metrical segmentation strategy, both infants and adults, they tend to segment the speech stream at the onset of stress syllables and at least least in the English language. So, they know that the most words in the English language starts by a stress on the first syllable, and so that is how they are able to segment. So, metrical segmentation strategy says that these are rules of thumb for segmenting speech streams. So, if there is a speech stream, if something is being stressed, is being spoken, how this is broken down into its basic properties or into basic segments is done by something called the metrical segmentation strategy. They assume that words begins on stressed syllables, for example English, because French words they could actually have the French words they can actually have a stress on the second syllables also used by infants and adults to segment this speech stream. Now, it is believed that English has a characteristic rhythmic pattern of alternating stress and unstressed syllables. Now, the stressed syllables have long or complex vowels sounds, while the unstressed syllables in English have reduced or shortened vowels. So, basically this idea that English has a rhythmic pattern of stress and unstressed syllables, and the idea that the stressed syllables are long or complex words, complex vowel sounds, while unstressed syllables have reduced shortened vowels. This is another interesting thing or used by the children or the neonates, the small children or newborns, to understand the speech segmentation, how to divide the speech which is there. Now, understand that the child when he is born, he does not have the idea of the phonemes, morphemes and that kind of a thing. So, basically what he does is he picks up these strings or picks up these ideas or generates these ideas from the way the mother is talking to the children, and so this kind of idea are this kind of the probability is that these are the rules which are used by the smaller children or children who are 6 to 8 months old or maybe around 6 months old. So, smaller children to understand the speech stream. So, Morgan 1996 he did an experiment to find out whether this metrical segmentation strategy is true or not, and so he presented 2 syllable sequences with stress on either the first and the second syllable. So, the idea was that whether smaller children or smaller children or older children, they can distinguish between, whether children can actually distinguish between this metrical segmentation strategy or can understand the difference between first stress syllable and the second stress syllable. So, what Morgan did was he produced words or he presented 2 syllable sequences with stress either on the first word on the first syllable or the second syllable to 6 and 9 months old infants, and they found out the 6 months infant, they did not respond to the differences between the first stress syllable and second stress syllable, whereas the 9 months old were able to distinguish between the first stress syllable and second stress syllable. So, when the second stress syllable was produced, they did not give this head response or they did not respond to it, or they were not able to distinguish between it, and that was the demonstration of metrical segmentation strategy as used by infants and adults to segment the speech system. Condition head turning technique. Now, infants trained to turn head when he detected changes in stimulus. So, another technique that is used to since children are small. So, how would they show responses when they are able to distinguish this change in speech stream, and so one another technique which is there is condition head turning technique. So, till the point of time that they cannot do this head turn thing, the high amplitude sucking technique is used, but then if they can turn their head, a condition head turning technique is used to demonstrate that the child is able to distinguish between certain aspects of the speech streams. So, as I said in Morgan's experiment, 9 months infant prefers strong weak stress pattern over weak strong stress pattern. So, when it was first syllable stressed and second syllable non-stress, they preferred this in relation to when they had the first syllable non-stressed and the second syllable stressed. Also at 6 months the preferences were not there. So, toddlers frequently impose strong weak stress pattern for spaghetti, this case manda. So, that kind of variation is there. Another interesting thing that is used by infants to understand the speech pattern or to decipher the speech pattern of the mothers or other caregivers is something called the idea of transaction probability. So, what is transaction probability? Transaction probability is the probability that given a particular sequence, what is the probability that the next sequence will follow it, or given a particular stimuli, what is the probability that related stimuli will follow. So, likelihood of a particular event will occur given next given the current event. So, transaction probability, they provide a fairly reliable cue to word boundaries that even young infants are sensitive to. So, basically what definition is? The definition says that the likelihood that a particular event will occur given the fact that event will occur next given the current event is already occurred is what is called transaction probability. And so, transaction probability, what it provides is that is a fairly reliable cue to word boundaries that even young infants are sensitive to. So, basically these transaction probabilities or the probability of the fact that a certain syllable will repeat after some other syllable, or a certain pattern will repeat after some other pattern, is used by infants, or is again used by infants to segment the speech stream. Now, at 8 months infant can use the transaction probability to segment speech stream as tested with condition head turn response. So, 8 months old infants were able to use this transaction probability mechanism to demonstrate, to segment the speech stream. For example, if now if pretty baby is something that the child is able to, or child hears a lot of times. So, if pret this pret is spoken, then there is a very high chance that ty or t will be repeated, and so the child if pret is there, the child always responds to or waits for or shows this condition head response to show that ty will follow, and so pretty is the word. But after pretty, the fact that baby will be repeated is very less, and so the child is does not show any response to that, because they do hear so many other words related to it. So, it is not that pretty baby is something that they always hear, because if the syllable pret is produced, they always know, or they turn their head to show that ty, which is pretty, will be what will be spoken next. But the fact that pretty will be followed by baby is the transaction probability is very less, and so the child does not show this condition head response or condition head response to it. But the moment, because it could be pretty dog, pretty eagle, pretty egg, and so on and so forth. So, anything could be there. But as soon as bay is spoken, the child shows a condition head reflex to show that baby will be followed, and so when the bay syllable is there, the b syllable will repeat it, that is shown by this transaction probability. So, the fact that if pret is spoken and ty will follow it, this is called the transaction probability, the condition transaction probability, and if bay is spoken, then b will follow, this is what is transaction probability. But the fact that if pretty is spoken, then baby follows it is an unfamiliar sequence, and so in this case the child does not respond to the head turning response. So, and some other techniques like statistical learning techniques are used by the child to segment the speech stream. What we have been doing all along is we are trying to tell you or how the child makes these identification of the speech stream or segment the speech stream. So, when he is hearing a speech, how does he know where to stop and where to start, or what are the boundaries of the speech. So, where is the word and where is the phase boundaries and that kind of thing, how does the child understand that? That is what we are trying to, or that is what I am trying to tell you. So, in infants, the transaction probability from prey to T is very high, likewise from bay to B is again very high. However, the transaction probability from T to bay is very low. So, from the syllable T, the fact that bay will follow, because it is pretty, right, and baby. So, pret and ty and bay and by. So, the transition probability between ty and bay is very low, whereas the transition probability between pret and t and bay and b is very high. So, infants are born with the ability to discriminate most speech sounds and through a process called perceptual narrowing and acquiring the phonetic categories of the language that they are learning during the first year of life. So, another thing that the infants use in segmenting the speech stream is something called perceptual narrowing. So, what is this perceptual narrowing? It is a transition from broad to narrow perceptual categories. So, what is it? They are born with the ability to discriminate most speech sounds, and through a process called perceptual narrowing they acquire the phonetic categories of the language they are learning during the first year of life. So, they use this perceptual narrowing for categorical perception or putting speech sounds into certain categories. At birth, infant perceive all possible speech categories. Now, by 1 year they perceive categories in their language. As I said, as I have been telling before, when a child is born, he is able to categorize differences in any language of the world, but as he grows or as he learns, as he talks to his mother more and more, he does this perceptual narrowing, or he attains this perceptual narrowing, and then he can only distinguishes the speech sounds or speech stream or differentiate between speech streams only in his mother tongue. So, experiments were done with English speaking children and Hindi speech or Hindi speech stream, and children were, or very small just born children were able to discriminate between two sequences. But when this child became 1 month old, he was not able to discriminate between changes in speech stream in Hindi, but they were able to do that in English. This particular process of how did they do it is basically called perceptual narrowing. They also use something called the distributed learning technique. So, the perceptual narrowing of phonetic categories is aided by a process which is called distributional learning. So, what is this distributional learning? It is a way of tracking of the frequency and localization of various sounds in the speech stream. So, the distributional learning is a is a process of tracking changes in the speech stream and narrowing down onto or localizing various sounds in the speech stream. So, distributional learning is tracking frequencies and localization of various speech sound in the speech stream, and it aids infants in organizing perceptual categories out of their language. So, basically this both perceptual narrowing and distributional learning are two techniques which the infant uses to understand the speech stream which is being spoken to him, and to distinguishing various characteristics of the speech and understand the speech, and basically perceive the speech and do categorical perception of the speech. So, this is what happens or how the child learns into or learns this speech stream, or basically the speech, and it is aided a lot by motheries of how mothers speak to their children. Now, towards the end of this section, we will look at several theories of speech and how these theories argument each other and or complement and discomplement each other. So, basically there are several theories of speech which is out there, and so these theories of speech is what we are going to learn next. So, we consciously believe that speech stream is a sequence of speech sounds grouped into words and phrases. So, we believe that when somebody is speaking, it is basically a continuous flow of words and phrases, but in reality we know that this is only an illusion. So, speech is not continuous at all. This is there is no speech is not non-continuous at all, it is a continuous thing. The observation that there are no reliable relationship between phoneme and the acoustic signal is known as the lack of invariance. So, the way the phoneme is being produced and the acoustic signal which is generated out of that phoneme, there is no relation between the two, and this is basically what is called the lack of invariance. So, no reliable relationship between phonemes and the acoustic signal. So, what speech signal is generated and what phoneme is being used there is no relation between these two, and this is called the lack of invariance. Now, the problem that theories of perception need to explain is how we are able to extract the original speech sound from the speech stream. Now, if the acoustic signal which is being produced and the phoneme which is there, if there is no relation between them, the theories of perception need to express how we perceive speech stream or how we are able to extract these things from the speech stream. And so, the first so problem for all theories of speech perception is that how do we extract original speech sound from the speech stream or the speech signal. So, there are three theories which have been proposed: the motor theory, the general auditory framework, and the direct realism. And so, we will go into these one by one. Let us look at the motor theory. So, motor theory is it uses a nativistic approach and views that behavior is mainly shaped by natural selection and encoded in genes. So, it believes that speech starts with genes, and so it has a nativistic view, it is in the gene somewhere, and so from there the speech perception is genetic in nature. And so, it is basically it is supported by Chomsky's ideas of language acquisition device, and Chomsky believes that there are specialized processing units in the brain, they guide rapid development of the languages infant. So, he believes that it is every child comes with every person comes with a language acquisition device, and in the childhood itself there are specialized units out there which basically let the infant learn the speech. So, Alvin Lieberman and his colleagues at the Haskin laboratory built a pattern playback machine that the use of which led to the development of the motor theory of speech perception. It was also the idea of module by Fodor in 1983 which led to the increment in the motor theory. So, dedicated neural systems evolved to perform specific function. So, generally speaking, it was Alvin Lieberman's and his colleagues idea of using the playback machine to develop this motor theory. And what is the basic idea of this motor theory? The idea of motor theory is that the way we speak is it's tracked by the changes in the vocal cord. So, motor theory, what it proposes is, it proposes that people perceive speech. How do we perceive speech? We perceive speech by inferring the movements of the vocal tract that produce this sound. So, by looking at the vocal tract which is producing this sound, we perceive speech. So, instead of analyzing the speech stream into its phonemes, instead of looking at speech in terms of its phonemes, the perception of speech actually progresses through, or it manifests through, it happens through tracking the way the vocal tract is responding when somebody is producing speech. In other words, we comprehend speech by imagining how we would make the sounds we are hearing. So, speech perception happens by another person or somebody who is hearing somebody speak. How he perceives speech is by imagining how he would have produced that speech, and so by that manner the speech perception happens. So, influenced by the theories of Chomsky and Fodor, motor theory argued that speech is special in manner. So, that is the basic of the motor theory, but as I said before, Chomsky's idea was there is something called the language acquisition device, and so this language acquisition device is the way or the reason how the smaller children or infants develop speech. Also, Fodor 1983 proposed the idea of a module, and he says that the brain has dedicated neural systems for learning speech, and that is how speech is basically perceived. And so, based on both their ideas, it was believed that speech is special in it is a special quality of human beings, and views of speech perception as distinct from general auditory perception. They believe that speech is different from general auditory perception. So, viewing of other auditory sounds is different from when you hear somebody speak. Now, what it says is that speech is processed by innate dedicated modules that are separated from general auditory perception. Now, speech is special was based on several reasons. Now, motor theory, people perceive speech by inferring articulated gestures of not analyzing the speech stream. So, basically the idea that speech is special, it is dedicated or it rests on three basic reasons. First, speech perception and production was viewed as a unique human ability. So, three reasons: speech production and perception is unique to humans first. Second, speech perception modules work independent of auditory perception. So, speech modules, they are independent of auditory perception system. And the third, third reason is that speech perception was proposed by the motor system. It was believed that speech perception, motor system aids speech perception, or speech perception happens through the motor systems. And so, these three reasons were quoted for the fact that speech is special. Also D, another reason that was given is that the objects of speech perception was not speech sound themselves, but rather the intended vocal tract gestures. So, speech perception was not looking at speech sounds, but on vocal tract gestures. So, how does the vocal tract actually move? That was the reason of, or that was the way the speech perception should be done. And so, this is the framework on which the motor theory was based. Now, ample research has been shown that non-human animals they perceive speech sounds in much the same way as humans do, forcing motor theorists to forsake the position that speech is special. And so, this idea that speech is special is basically nullified, or it has been taken back by the by these evidences that non-humans and non-humans would perceive speech sounds in much the same way as humans do. So, that is the basic of the motor theory. Now, to distinguish the motor theory, or to basically cover up the fact of motor theory that speech is special, another theory was proposed which is called the general auditory framework. The general auditory framework, what does it say? Speech perception operates with the same mechanism that have evolved for the perception of environmental sound. So, there are several. What is the proposal? The proposal is that speech perception operates by the same mechanisms that have evolved for perceiving environmental sounds, and they are not special. Speech perception is not special from some other ways of perception. Now, there are several evidences which go against the motor theory, which have been provided by the general auditory framework, which goes against the motor theory. The first evidence against motor theory is that human infant speech processing. How humans infant process speech, that has been quoted as the basic reason of how the general auditory framework differs from the motor theory. Now, human infants are born with the ability to discriminate nearly all possible speech sounds, yet they do not begin speaking a year later. So, as has been said that they are able to discriminate all speech sounds, but they do not speak by first year. And so, they basically that is a reason that these general auditory framework people they propose against the motor theory. But then general auditory framework believes that infants have this ability because human languages only make sound distinctions that the auditory system is already sensitive to. So, the way the human auditory system perceives is the same way is used for perception of speech, and so infants also use the same system. Now, the motor theories also cite human infant speech processing as support for their own theory, especially the claim that speech perception involves innate modules. Motor theory, they believe that speech perception production system is hardwired to the brain and guide the development of language specific skills in both perception and production during the first year of life. So, the same idea or the same evidence that is used by the general auditory framework people, that infant speech processing, that they believe that infant speech processing supports their theory, the same thing is used by the motor theorists. And what the motor theory says that there are innate modules in the speech perception in the infants which help them in perceiving speech, whereas what evidence that the general framework people are using is that although infants are able to perceive changes in speech or perceive various differences in speech by before 1 year of age, only by 1 year they start speaking. So, before 1 year they can understand these changes, and they respond to it also when they see a change, but by using perceptual narrowing they start speaking by first year of life, and so that is one evidence. So, human infants can discriminate speech sounds before they can speak. Now, the second evidence which is used by the general auditory framework against the motor theory comes from the observation of speech perception in non-humans animals, for example, the chinchillas. And so, non-human animals they can distinguish speech sounds. So, that is another second evidence. So, this is my first evidence and this is my second evidence of general auditory framework against the motor theory. So, chinchillas categorize perceive speech da and ta. So, they can do this categorical perception. Also, Japanese koala perceive d in da, di, do as the same despite co-articulation effects. So, this is another thing which is there. Now, speech perception is so complex that we use any available cues. Now, researchers working in the general auditory framework takes the proposition that speech is such a complicated task that human takes advantage of whatever information is available, how imperfect, to tackle this problem. So, speech perception is not innate, it is not processed by a dedicated system. What it says is speech perception, the general auditory framework says that it happens, speech perception happens in the same way as the auditory perception, but then humans take advantage of all available imperfect cues from the environment and the speech sound itself to distinguish or tackle the problem of speech perception. Now, one example of this approach is something called the fuzzy logical modules of perception. And so, what is this model of perception? It proposes that we arrive at perceptual decisions by matching the relative goodness of various sensory inputs against their values of particular prototype stored in memory. So, when we are doing perception, what we do is we look at various examples of the object in question and we compare them to prototypes, and then we do a matching. How good a match is a particular stimuli with the perceptual perceptual prototype which has been stored, and that gives an idea of how perception takes place. So, lack of invariance is not a problem because contextual cues are always taken into account, and so this general auditory framework does not suffer from this idea of lack of invariance. So, perceptual decisions made by matching relative goodness of sensory inputs to prototypes in the memory, and so there is a how good the sensory input is, based on that the perception is happening. So, information from other modalities are also used if available. So, not only the speech perception system, visual and other modalities also help the generally auditory framework. So, Chiala's categorize perceptual onset time, and so this is an example to show that non-humans can also do this kind of speech perception, and so speech is not special. And the last theory that we are going to do today is called something called direct realism. So, motor theory has made comeback with Carol Fowler's idea of direct realism, which is again Carol Fowler is again from the Haskin lab. Now, this new version of motor theory is called the direct realism, and it is based on Gibson's 1979 theory that we have direct awareness of the world because the sensory input is sufficiently rich for us to completely recover an object for perception. Now, if you remember Gibson's idea, Gibson believed or gave the idea of direct perception and believes that the lies which are falling onto the eyes, that has all the information that is necessary for us to perceive. Similarly, this direct realism also believes that the sound which is falling onto the ear, that has enough information for us to perceive speech. So, direct realism says that sensory inputs is sufficiently rich, allowing us to completely recover the objects of perception, and it is basically a Gibsonian view as used in perception 1979, direct perception. If you do a direct comparison, or if you want to compare how this Gibsonian view fits into this idea. Now, one way in which the direct realism differs from motor theory is that it rejects the idea that speech is special. It believes the speech is not special, it is general in case, and so the speech which is falling on your ears has all the information which is necessary for you to perceive. You do not do this categorical perception or perceptual narrowing or that kind of things are not there. Also, direct realism, they believe that speech processing, it involves perceiving gestures, not acoustic signals. So, speech perception is not processing acoustic signals, rather it is processing gestures. So, based on gestures the perception of speech is happening, not on terms of how acoustic signal is perceived. The direct realism also holds on to the claim that the motor system is involved in perception of speech. So, direct realism believes that motor system, so because the gestures are done by the motor system or the vocal tract, and so they believe that the motor system is involved in processing of speech. Now, the idea that hence we have direct awareness of world, no influence is needed. Now, the very fact that evidences are provided to this this direct realism is through the concept of something called motor neurons, mirror neurons. And what is this mirror neurons? So, mirror neurons which have been found in monkeys for the first time, they provide biological evidence for the tight linkage between perception and action. And so, what are these mirror neurons? Mirror neurons are neurons which are in the brains of the primate that fire when they perform a particular action, and they also fire when a particular person sees an act that he has done before or he wants to do, and they fire. So, whether he is observing an act in being action or whether he is acting, in both the cases the motor neurons actually fire. And so, this mirror neuron is a biological evidence to the fact that the idea that speech is not the idea that there is nothing special in speech. So, it rejects the speech is special thing, and motor in system involved in speech perception. First time we come to know that motor systems are involved in perception of speech. So, mirror neurons, these are neurons in primates that fire when perceiving or performing a task. So, not only perceiving a task, it is also performing a task, and so we do an act or we perceive an act being done, the mirror neuron fires. So, that's basically an evidence, a biological evidence to the fact that speech perception is through direct realism, and links perception and motor systems together. Also, the direct realistic theorists, they view mirror neurons as providing the mechanisms for linking perception and action, not just in speech but in perception also. The direct realism aligns itself to the notion of embodied cognition. So, it basically it forwards the idea of embodied cognition, which basically says that cognition rooted in body's interaction with the environment. And so, what is it? A point of view arguing that cognition is rooted in the body's interaction with the world around it. So, basically how the cognition is not only in the mind or brain, it is the way we interact with the environment. And so, this idea of embodied cognition is very basic to the idea of the idea of direct realism. Now, essential purpose of brain is to provide the organism with information about the environment in order to guide the behavior. So, what the brain actually does, it provides information to the organism about his environment around us. The way the organism interacts with the environment in terms of the information which has been provided with the brain, that provides the way we perceive speech. And so, this is the idea of direct realism. So, basically that should bring us to the end of this section. Now, what we did today is we looked at how speech perception happens in neonates. So, basically small children or just born children, how do they perceive speech? And so, we saw several mechanisms, we saw several ways of responding, and the basic idea that they develop is that this small children at a very early age, even one month from the time they are born, they are able to distinguish these speech sounds, and that happens because the mother speak to them in a very particular manner with the motherese. And so, these motherese, the way the motherese is spoken, that gives the child to make a perception of what are the word boundaries and face boundaries and that kind of a thing, and so that helps them. And so, this is not theoretical, because the sucking reflex, the high sucking reflex and the head turning reflex, these two reflexes basically demonstrate the way demonstrate the fact that the child is able to discriminate, or the infant is able to discriminate between different speech sounds. We also looked at the idea of how the idea of we also are able to see how this idea of perceptual narrowing. So, how this perceptual narrowing and distributed learning, they are used by the children for understanding speech or variations in speech. We also saw how transaction probabilities signal the fact that speech is perceived by children. Next, we focused on the various theories of speech perception. We started with motor theory, which believes that speech perception is not only perceiving speech, it basically speech perception happens the way the vocal cord is vibrating, and so the vocal cord vibration is primary to perception of speech. We also saw the idea in speech perception in motor theory that speech is special, and it is basically furthered by Chomsky's idea of the language acquisition device, which believes that the child has innate modules or predetermined modules in the brain which helps in processing speech. Also Fodor supports this theory or this idea of speech perception. Then we come to the auditory framework. The general auditory framework believes that speech is not special. So, speech perception happens in the similar way in which other non-animal or other auditory sounds are perceived, and so he gives a lot of evidences. This theory, the general auditory framework, uses a lot of evidences to prove that speech is not special and it is general in nature, and speech perception happens by a phonological method. Now, there is a third concept of speech perception which is called the direct realism, which believes that again the motor systems involved in speech perception, and the speech which is coming to the infant or anyone for that matter, it has enough information in it to be perceived or to give you the idea of perception, and it rejects the idea that speech is special, and it uses the concept or it uses the evidences of mirror neurons, the biological mirror neurons, to support its idea that speech is not special, but it is general in characteristics, but then the speech stream which is coming to you has all the information which is necessary. Further, it also uses something called embodied cognition. It develops the direct realism, it develops the idea of embodied cognition, which means that brain creates or it makes us familiar with the environment, and our interaction with the environment is what creates cognition around us. That's a review of how speech is perceived and speech is made and perceived. Now, when we meet next, we look at how speech is produced. So, the production of speech by humans, that is what we are going to focus in the upcoming 2 lectures, but until we do that, it is goodbye from here, and thank you.